Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and start. I know from the RSVP list that we still got a few people who are going to be joining us, but they can jump in as we go forward. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I want to thank our speakers and introduce them. Tonight, two of the partners of designLAB, Sam Batchelor and Kelly Haig, are going to talk about their practice, but also about the Hitchcock Center that designLAB designed. And they're going to talk about the firm's unique approach to practice. But I also just want to mention, the firm itself was founded by Bob Miklos and has become, it's grown into a really thriving practice that's very inspiring, I think, for everybody in Boston. And I also wanted to let Patrick Murphy, my co-chair, tell us a little bit about what we're going to be doing next month before Kelly and Sam jump in.
Thanks. So on December 16th, we'll have our next BSA Committee on the Environment session. It will be a presentation by Zachary Flora from the Center for Active Design about Fitwell's new viral response module. So I'm sure a number of you are already familiar with health and wellness design, even incorporating WELL or Fitwell certifications into your design. And now both platforms actually have, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, have a specific certification for your building designs and operations in reaction to the pandemic, and to enable buildings that we design to be designed for and operate for the future of future pandemics, or even common cold and flu seasons. So we're looking forward to having Zachary provide an overview of one of those platforms next month, and look forward to seeing you all there.
Okay, that's fantastic. So for the attendees, if you've got questions for Kelly and Sam, please, or anybody else on the call, please type them into the chat and they're going to respond to them. I think it's a fairly small group, so we can keep it conversational. So go ahead and type them in as we go if you have questions, and maybe we can open it up and have it be quite conversational. Okay, so Sam and Kelly, turn it over to you for the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael and Patrick. Yeah, so thank you for having us here to speak to the Committee on the Environment about the Hitchcock Center project. As you mentioned, we're going to also kind of give a little bit of background as to kind of our general practice and philosophy, which is deeply tied to the environment and sustainable design, with the kind of context of 2 or 3 other projects, and then end on the Hitchcock Center, talking about that specifically, but wanted really to be able to put things in the context of our overall practice and philosophy, because I think the Hitchcock Center really is a great example of that and benefits from that that context. So with that, our philosophy that we've sort of articulated is this idea of critical stewardship, and I'll let Kelly speak to that more specifically.
Yes, so my name is Kelly Haig. I'm also a partner at designLAB, architect, and all the projects we're going to show you tonight are projects that Sam and I worked on together, where we've really started to hone in on this idea of critical stewardship. So we call our approach a design based on the universal responsibility of history and the environment, but always looking through the lens of community. We think this is really important because there's a lot of work that looks at preservation and sustainability, but we think that really community piece of it, the human being, is an important factor in that.
So the term critical stewardship is born out of the idea of stewardship as a reference to resources, particularly the environment, but also built or cultural resources. And it's emboldened or interpreted through this idea of critique or critical in both senses of the word, both the idea that it's essential, but offering critique.
And what we really love about this is that it really cuts across typologies. So whether it's new construction or renovation or urban or rural projects, it's really something that we can look at specifically and essentially throughout all of our work. So it allows us to operate with a consistent methodology and a range of contexts and styles so that the outcomes are more reflective of the places and the people that we're working with rather than our own kind of design aesthetics and preconceptions.
So critical stewardship reflects the idea that the architecture of today is part of a historical and environmental continuum of which we are all really a part. So the idea is that with each intervention, we guide an evolution. And so despite the feeling of timelessness or permanence, buildings and places are malleable, and they all are the result of decisions made up to a point, and we have the power to make new ones, but a responsibility that comes with that. And so each moment is really only a single moment in this continuum of change, and that touches both the past and the future.
So we know that all buildings and places continuously age. And we like to borrow Paul Goldberger's argument that no matter what the attitude is, whether you're trying to hold back the tide of time or embrace the power, that we have to intervene. And as soon as we're done painting the Golden Gate Bridge, we have to start all over again, which involves choice. Critical stewardship allows for the interpretation, but also acknowledges original intent or context as a rubric, along with material conservation and form. And we have to trust ourselves as the designers to make both bold and nuanced determinations about change based on research, analysis, context, over dogmatic requirements or mandates. We have to direct our focus to people and away from things.
So we've tried to kind of outline how this approach is put into effect in a range of contexts. And as Kelly said, one of the things that's really important to us is that this philosophy operates in a range of typologies and contexts. So we're going to do a few examples here. The first of which is this idea of historic. And so historic architecture in this context, by that we mean, turn of the century, 20th, 19th century, or earlier in that time. And it's also important for us to acknowledge that this context is not limited simply to existing buildings, right? And one of the things we're trying to get away from here is the idea that context only exists in existing buildings. So we can have, natural environmental context. We can be doing a new building in a historic neighborhood. We can be doing a new building in a industrial or agrarian environment, and those contexts are still just as important as if you're renovating an existing building, and that has context.
So the first project we'd like to introduce you to under the historic context is the BCYF Curley Community Center, which is in South Boston. It was built in 1931 by Mayor James Michael Curley, and it was built, purpose-built as a bathhouse to serve South Boston's immigrant population at the time, which had really inadequate indoor plumbing. It is 40 feet wide by 1/4 mile long. And that really reflects its kind of historic use as a bathhouse. So the building, as you can see here, was really organized around 3 primary entrances that corresponded with 3 city streets. And historically, those sections were separated by gender and age. So going from right to left, you had women's, men's, and boys sections respectively. It's a 1-story structure that's elevated on piles with the exception of a really small basement and 2 very, very limited upper floors. And you'll Also notice that there are a series of timber fences that extend out into the water that also separated the beach by gender, which is a separation that exists to this day. So today the center is owned by the City of Boston and is operated by BCYF, which are really there to kind of enhance the quality of life through community programming for Boston's neighborhoods. So at this location, they have quite a number of different programs. It has been the continuous home to the L Street Brownies, who host the New Year's Eve Polar Plunge, but it also has a lot of fitness and wellness programs and a wide array of children's and seniors programming. So from the onset of design, we identified a series of goals to guide us, which included, making spaces for the community, making it accessible and equitable to everybody, to improve the safety of the building, which has been a real challenge just based on its configuration, better transparency, and finally to bolster the resiliency to protect the historic structure from the impacts of climate change. And that last point, resiliency, was a particular challenge in this project, given its siting and configuration and age. So you can see here a mapping from the Climate Ready Boston initiative, which, as many of you I'm sure are quite familiar with this, was looking at, the compromised portions of South Boston in this particular map. And you can see Curley Center dashed at the south of the flood zone. The study did identify Curley as a candidate for flood proofing, but the nuances of how we actually approach that were pretty complex. So during concept design, actually originally it was just an interior renovation, but throughout the conceptual design, we knew that kind of identified the need to have specifically resilient measures and did a whole resiliency study so that we could kind of scope out and test those solutions. So just a quick overview, there was just, again, a lot of nuance in starting to deal with resiliency, both the fact that we were right up against the water and also that we had 3 different elevations. So we needed a slightly different strategy at each section of the building. And in the end, we did a combination of both wet flood proofing and dry flood proofing in order to do that. So we had slightly different targets and kind of technologies to get us there along the length of the building. And just scaling this out to the building of the section so that we can start to see how, again, the kind of sustainable and resiliency goals start to dovetail in with other issues like equity and accessibility. We just have a section through the building, which you can see originally separated the lobby from the beach through this private gender separated locker room. And so our proposed design, which is currently in construction, moves all the mechanicals up out of the flood zone. It really opens up the lobby all the way to the beach and allows, all members of the community, regardless of age or gender, to use the same beaches together. The general organization remains the same, but we are starting to separate the beaches by program rather than gender. So programs beach and programs off of K Street, the primary members beach at the L Street, which is the largest, and just an events beach at the smallest. And, of course, making new plazas that are accessible and inviting, that kind of create moments along Day Boulevard for the community. So just a couple of images of what the final proposal looks like. This is from Day Boulevard. This is the L Street lobby where you can see we've kind of opened up the floor to have a 2-story solarium and just allowing people to move in and through. And finally, a series of decks at the beach side that, again, just allow everybody to kind of come down and be at the beach together.
So increasingly, we've been doing renovations of mid-century buildings also. And so this is a distinction here between the sort of historic renovation and the more mid-century renovation. Which has its own unique set of challenges and ideas. So we've done renovations of buildings from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and what's unique there is a lot of these buildings are really built more on architectural ideas and theories rather than sort of more formal stylistic rules. So it allows us for a broader level of interpretation and intervention. The example that I'm just going to mention quickly here is the Fine Arts Center, Kevin Roche's Fine Arts Center at UMass Amherst. We're currently renovating the bridge, which is the section in the upper left of this image. It's another long, narrow building. This one is about 40 feet long, wide by 600 feet long. There's a better view of the length of it. But the fundamental change here was to actually shift make a pretty drastic change from the way Kevin Roche designed it, which was using this section. It's divided into 3 bays. Here, the bay on the right being a continuous hallway down the length of it, a center bay that had this tall clear-story skylight, and then the south bay on the left had this smaller sloped south-facing skylight. And because the hallway then was essentially this 600-foot windowless corridor, we actually flipped it and put the hallway on the south side, bringing natural light into that, which allowed the classrooms to maintain the large south-facing clear story, but then to use the windowless bay as a either storage or kind of more utilitarian space within each classroom. So each classroom then has this kind of character in it which maintains the large clear story windows while having that lower ceiling area. But then the hallway has this continuous skylight all the way down the length of it. And one of the benefits there is also that crossing the bridge to get to this hallway necessitates that at each entry point where the stairs are, there is a common area that allows you to sort of orient yourself and pause through the length of this project. So what's been interesting to us about this is sort of making an assessment and, you know, ideally improvement on the original concept of this bridge from the original design, while still maintaining some of the really beautiful characteristics of it at the clear story.
So industrial buildings are really born out of the idea of utility, but now they have a certain amount of nostalgia as well. So included in this grouping are some more anonymous buildings where the value is really in pure functionality and its original goal of utility, which we find offers a lot of flexibility. Here again, these range from really historic structures like the mill on the left to new buildings that are designed to celebrate an industrial heritage, despite not really having a historic artifact. The center 2 buildings are both new, but again, are kind of hearkening back to this industrial heritage of a site. And of course, we also try with MIT to the right to start to find value in a history of place that might not be immediately evident to start. This is the existing conditions of the MIT Theater Arts, which is a project to serve a non-major program of arts for MIT students. Originally, it was a program that was really dispersed amongst lots of buildings, and they never really had a central home that was just there. So this project was both kind of finding a new way for them to work, but also creating a new identity for them in the process. This is a view of the final built product, and we worked with the department heads, Sarah and Jay, to really envision kind of what it means for a theater arts program to be at this school like MIT. And what they really wanted was a space that was beautiful but unprecious, and that was kind of their way of kind of envisioning the kind of space they wanted to work in. So for us, the value of the structure actually wasn't in its beauty, because it was quite generic, but it was actually in the zoning and the opportunity for a 0 lot line, but also just the existing structure and the carbon footprint that we were able to save. So we had this idea of just infilling the brick box painting it all one color and starting to cut in holes to express the work within. So this is the final composition. So we had, you know, an addition pop up to the center that was the performing space, and around it all of these openings that started to show various pieces of the process, like designing and prototyping and things of that nature. Again, just a view into the wood shop, which was really about putting the back of house on display. They were as interested in how they were working and how they were making, rather than just the end piece of the theater work. And since we insulated the envelope, we actually lost a lot of the existing grit that I think really spoke to the theater programs. But we did have this wall that separated the two volumes of space that could remain opening. So this really became the feature wall of the project, where we could kind of celebrate the kind of layers of history of the building. We located our primary stair there, and this was all about kind of, again, expressing the utility and history of the space. And last, we're really kind of looking at, they were really inspired by this artwork that was an installation that read "Bits and Pieces Put Together to Present a Semblance of the Whole." And they felt like that was really conveyed how they worked and how they saw themselves. And so we started thinking about all of these different textures and materials and how people could install within it as kind of working in a similar way, to be a composition of different things that come together to create a whole.
So the last kind of context and that the sort of project will spend the most time on is the this idea of the agrarian context. And so the Hitchcock Center is a project in this context, but again, we've done a number in this vein, from the headquarters of the IFAW to some work for the trustees of reservation. But, you know, as I mentioned here, what we were interpreting and working with is not the context of an existing building, but the environmental context. And so here, the red dot is the project location. The highlighted area is the Connecticut River Valley watershed. And the two highlighted bodies of water are the Connecticut River and the Quabbin Reservoir. And so the context here that we're working with, we wanted to be really cognizant of. The Hitchcock Center is an environmental education center. Their goal is to promote environmental literacy. And so in doing so, you know, the core mission was to kind of put the building and the people in the context of the environment. And I should say that, as was mentioned, this is a Living Building Challenge certified project. So it had that overlay on top of it. And happy to sort of talk through any of the more technical aspects of that in the Q&A. But for us, it wasn't really a driver so much as it was sort of one of the tools and one of the kind of levers and advocacy channels that we used throughout the process. So in addition to the macro environment, we also look very closely at the micro environment and the building itself. This is the site before the building was on there. So this was some site analysis we did along with our landscape architects at Stimson Studio. And the site was really remarkable because it had, across a relatively small site, at least 5 microclimates. There was an existing hayfield that was actively hayed by a neighboring farmer. It had a remnant orchard that was at one point a commercial apple orchard, but had been kind of overgrown and gone fallow. There was this wetland, this seasonal wetland. It was actually a vernal wetland because it's at the top of this hill, successional meadow, and then this open meadow. And so that all ultimately became really core to the planning of the building. One of the major drivers for the building's planning was this idea that they wanted to have 2 school groups outside playing that would not interfere with each other. So the whole building was set up with this offset axes to create these 2 outdoor play spaces, which we called the den play area and the nest play area. And again, here, this was really trying to bring awareness to the environmental context in which they were operating and the different factors that affected them. So the nest play area was or is south facing. It's a lot brighter. The building, because the hill falls away, the building is kind of set up on the landscape, and it's a drier, sunnier space. The den play area is set into the hillside a bit. It's on the north side of the building, so it has more shade. It abuts the vernal wetland, so it has some sort of wetter areas. In fact, they built, after we were done, what they called a mud kitchen, which is exactly what it sounds like. So here then is a photo of the nest play area, which kind of demonstrates the sunniness, the brightness, the way the building rises above the landscape. And this is the den with the building set into the landscape here with the woods at the edge. This is, again, the edge of the nest standing at what we call the ecotone, which is that center portion of the building. And it really operates as the sort of transitional moment between the two landscapes in terms of the den and the nest, but also in terms of the two wings of the building. If you remember from that axon diagram, the building had a sort of a north wing and a south wing. The south wing is the sort of visitor center component and is really about kind of observed principles of nature. And the classroom section on the north is really about applied principles of nature. So this is a view inside the ecotone. This is that transitional space. Again, for us and for this project, it was always about bringing it back to ideas of context and analogy. So stained into the floor here is a map of the Connecticut River watershed. You can see, again, the Quabbin Reservoir on the lower right-hand corner of the floor. And, you know, this is also the spot in the building where water is gathered from the roof for the potable water system for the building. So the building captures rainwater and deposits it into an underground cistern for use in the building. But this moment is what's called the first flush system, wherein they basically take the first 16th inch of water that runs off the roof, catch it in these clear canisters, and deposit it into a bioswale so that the dirtiest water, that first 16th of an inch, is not put into the building system to clog up the filters and otherwise kind of generally muck it up. And so there's a number of really kind of interesting and exciting concepts and ideas here. The first is simply the notion of a watershed, that it can be big or small. It can be the size of an entire river valley running across 4 states, or it can just be a roof, as it is here. The other thing is that of scale. So you can see these cylinders are graduated, and there's the idea of how sort of as you know, you have a large area like a roof. When these containers fill up, that represents only a 16th of an inch of rainfall. And as it rains, they fill up quite quickly. So if you're in the building when it's raining decently hard, these 4 canisters fill up in the space of about 20 minutes. And so it's pretty exciting to kind of sit there and watch them fill and hear the sound of the rain and understand the sort of relative scales of a roof, and sort of when people talk about inches of rainfall, how that adds up really quickly over large areas. Okay, you want to jump in on some of these?
Yeah. So I think, you know, to that point, it was as much about designing a building that could be net zero water and energy as starting to embed all of this kind of pedagogy into the way the building worked, because they really saw the building as kind of a proof of concept that we as humans can learn from nature and make a building that acts like nature. And so that was a really important piece of the design project. So in parallel with just designing the the structure itself and trying to engineer it to meet the goals of LBC, we also did a whole system of exhibits throughout. So what you see here is actually a large wall graphic when you first enter in that starts to talk about nature principles that the Hitchcock Center pedagogy always speaks to. So this is the language of the environmental educators. So things like nature running on sunlight and nature fitting form to function. So this is how they kind of teach. And so what we wanted to do is embed all of these teaching moments throughout the building in a really specific way so they can understand how like we as humans can operate within nature rather than outside of nature in a hands-off way, that it was about kind of learning and embedding ourselves within these nature principles. And so part of it was, you know, looking at just their curriculum and their resources and how they teach. They had whole combination of, you know, live exhibits and taxidermy. And, you know, so in every instance, we were trying to find a way to leverage the design of the space to tell a few different things. So one example was this large rock, which we called the Basking Boulder. And it's placed on the south side, and you know, there they can start to talk about the idea of a heat sink and how, you know, snakes go up onto a stone to warm themselves by the sun. And so there's a lot of, you know, different ideas that can be learned and kind of expressed throughout the architecture. And some of them were also just in looking at some of the background of the systems that support the image. So what you see to the left is the compost from the composting toilets above. There's a very, very small basement really to support this this function. And we understand that it is the hit of all the young kids. It's like one of their favorite things to see. So, you know, it's both showing them that like, look, composting toilets could happen anywhere. And this is something that you could take home and you could actually have at your own house in your own space. And then to the right is a dashboard that we designed. I mean, we actually worked to the point of trying to help design software so that it, again, kind of displayed the function and the output of the building from just how much energy it's using, how much water it's collected, things like that. But that it also started to get back to the big ideas of principles and started to tell the story about the living building challenge and how that impacted the space itself. So there was a lot of kind of working back and forth between the design and also the curriculum. And I think what was really interesting about that is that their curriculum through the project actually changed quite a bit. They used to be very much about looking at nature and teaching to nature itself. And through this process, the role of design and engineering as a really critical advocacy tool became more apparent. So now a lot of the work that they do and the work that they're doing with the neighboring schools and within the school systems is starting to look at how, you know, design and engineering can be a field that an environmentalist wants to go into, and kind of speaking to the power of that and how we're all interconnected. So we've been really just amazed by seeing how, again, their program has really evolved through this process of creating this living building.
So maybe to kind of wrap things up, we have a little bit of a kind of summary call to action, because as we mentioned, this idea of critical stewardship operates at the intersection of historic and sustainable design, looking through the lens of community. So we think both of these movements actually also have a lot to learn from each other. So from one side, you know, we think actually that sustainable design has a lot to learn from the preservation movement. Preservation movement is now 50 years old. It's incredibly successful, and it is really entrenched in almost every zoning ordinance in every city and town. And I think one of the things that preservation did really successfully is it recognized that social change happens first at the local level. And I think, sustainability has a lot of focus at the national level, hopefully more so in the next 4 years. But even so, looking for the federal government to be the catalyst to make things happen is I think a little bit backwards. Every city and town could have sustainable design requirements, just like they have historical guidelines that are adapted at a local level, at a zoning level, that would be able to get implemented much faster, would be able to sort of build a body of work that proves this as a viable building strategy, that proves it not just as sort of possible, but as possible to require, which I think is a lot of the hang up at the moment. So kind of taking that idea of the pace of social change and applying it to sustainable design requirements, I think is something really powerful, and something that is represented really well in this image we borrowed from Bloomberg News, just looking at a number of sort of critical social movements in the US and the adoption at the state level before they were adopted at a federal level.
And so recently there's been also a renewed focus on monuments throughout the country, as this recent photo of Christopher Columbus in the North End reminds us. And so as we're talking and kind of reflecting on that internally at Design Lab, we think it's important to remember that buildings are monuments of sorts too. Reflecting back on our work at the Curley Center, we started the process and it really seemed to have a lot of the trappings of a traditional preservation project. There was some local resistance to change, and there were a whole slew of regulatory challenges that we had to go through. But while it's currently a community center, it also served as a temporary high school in Boston during one of its most overt displays of racism, which was busing and integration. So not only that, but it also, until it closed this spring for COVID, was operated as a gender separated structure. So for women to walk from one end to the other, we had to go out to the street and walk down the sidewalk. So, for us, we felt like equity was as crucial of a design issue as preservation was in this particular project. And so what we wanted to do is start to think of how we can develop tools that we can use more broadly within Design Lab to help us better tackle kind of the social aspects of the project. So this is an example of one of those tools, which is a community mapping that we've actually written into our internal QA/QC processes with the goal of really tracking the social impact alongside other things like carbon accounting and energy modeling and historic research. So those were always kind of tools that we use to hold ourselves accountable. And now we're starting to also layer in this idea of kind of community impact and social justice to understand, how they all come together.
So similarly, there's a lot that historic preservation can gain from sustainable design, and the sort of dogmatic approach of previous historic preservation eras needs to be broadened to looser modes of interpretation, as I think we've started to look at with our mid-century renovation projects and some of this industrial renovation projects that we looked at, and we've spoken with and lectured with Amanda Hurley, who's talked about this a lot, but that the sort of mantle of preservation and historic building really needs to be broadened to include a wider cross-section of buildings, and to give architects the latitude to reinterpret that building stock in order to preserve them, not just as sort of historic resources from a sort of nostalgic or social sense, but as real valuable environmental and cultural resources. So, Kelly talked a little bit about this at MIT, but simply the idea that we're retaining this existing structure, even though it's not a terribly celebrated or significant historic structure. The character of the walls, it's important to sort of layer on this history, even when that history is not the sort of classic picture book history you think of. And the the reason for that from a carbon standpoint is becoming more and more evident as these buildings become higher performance and we achieve higher performance models for both new and renovated buildings. The embodied energy becomes a much bigger piece of the pie as we shrink that operational energy. Similarly, it's becoming increasingly clear that the impact on climate change that we're seeking to affect needs to be much, much, much sooner. So while if we amortize the energy impacts over the 50-year lifespan of a building, the operational energy is a much more significant portion. If we're looking at the first 10 years, then the embodied energy becomes a much more significant piece of it, which is really where we need to find the most immediate impact for this really urgent issue. And so, lastly, we want to loop back to the Hitchcock Center because we see it as one of our most sustainable projects, not because it's net zero water and net zero energy, but because it has had and continues to have a tremendous impact on the local building environment through industry advocacy and regulatory change, which is really where the Living Building Challenge, I think, differentiates itself. It also has a tremendous impact on the community where it operates through its programming and outreach. And I think this is helping us recognize the importance of advocacy in building projects, not just from a sustainability standpoint, but across the board. So I think with that, we'll open it up to questions. If folks have them, they can type them in the chat or just unmute yourself and jump in.
Yeah, this is Michael. I would like to encourage people to go, since it is a fairly small group, let's see if we can pull it off just by unmuting yourself and ask any questions that you might have for Design Lab.
This is Tom Parks. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the client in the Hitchcock Center and the relationship and the process that you went through to get to where you got in terms of final programming and so on.
Yeah, so the Hitchcock Center is a environmental education center, as I said, and we were initially selected to do a programming and feasibility study with them. So we did I think a 12-week programming and feasibility study with them prior to design, and actually the project was sort of on hold for I don't know, a year or so between that study and the actual beginning of design. And Living Building Challenge was not necessarily a given at the beginning of that study, but through that process looked at Living Building Challenge as well as their program and their goals, and determined that the Living Building Challenge was really a good fit for them and a good fit for their project, so that when we started back up into schematic design, that had been sort of adopted as part of our mandate.
And I will say that we did look at a couple of different sustainability metrics to see which one fit them the most. And I think the advocacy piece of the Living Building Challenge was something that really spoke to them, that it was about actually, being an example of how to do things in a more mindful and sustainable way, and kind of putting your money where your mouth is in that respect. And so I think that was something that was really important from the start, along with just the idea that, ILFI looks at things like beauty and, justice and stuff like that in equal parts to just energy production and consumption. So they just felt that kind of holistic goal of ILFI really spoke to them and reflected their values. And that's why ultimately we decided to go that way.
Gosh, there was some incredibly beautiful work there, you guys. I think Design Lab has done just such terrific work, and I'm glad you got a chance to show it. I've got a question for you about the Hitchcock Center. It's really two questions. So you said that, you know, a single building only has so much impact. So Sam, you said it's not so much that we made this one zero net energy and water building. It's more the effect that it had in that area on advocacy and the regulatory climate. And that's something that I think quite a few of us, I know back at Architectura, we used to talk about that, like how much impact are these, no matter how good they are, how much are these single buildings changing the world in ways? And if they are, is it how? Because it's not so much that the kilowatts, right? So talk a little bit more about maybe, especially anything specific that the building has influenced in terms of regulatory or advocacy climate.
Sure. So I think there's there's sort of two aspects to that. One is a little softer than the other, but the sort of softer one is just driving behavioral change in people who come to visit it. That, you know, seeing that composting toilets don't stink, and that, you know, a net zero building is still warm and comfortable. You know, that was one of the big discussions actually early on about, like, you know, it's going to be really hard to achieve net zero energy. Do we really want to, you know, can we afford to air condition the space? And ultimately they were, you know, adamant, and someone made a great point that, like, you want people who come to the building to be comfortable. You don't want them to associate a net zero building with being too hot. And so that was,
the educators have a pretty broad range of comfort.
yeah, because the educators and the users at first were like, well, yeah, we can wear shorts in the summer. We don't need air conditioning. We don't need to sort of keep it at, you know, 68 degrees all year round. We can tolerate that. But ultimately it was about that. And, you know, little things like we actually, to the greatest extent allowable by building code, we did not use occupancy sensors, because we wanted people to understand that they are a part of the system and they need to turn the lights off when they leave, and that the environment shouldn't just sort of take care of itself around you, and that, you know, you have a role. And similarly, we have this pretty fun but still very low-tech system of passive ventilation, where they determined the sort of temperature and humidity band in which natural ventilation through the windows was viable. And when it's in that band, the heating system turns off and a little green light goes on in every room. And that's how everybody knows it's time to open the windows if they're hot, and instead of adjusting the thermostat. And then if it, you know, cools back down or heats up too much, the red light goes on and everybody has to go and shut all the windows. And if somebody, you know, leaves the room and forgets to do that, or just ignores it, and the heat turns on and the windows are wide open, you know, then yeah, it blows the energy performance. Like, the building's not user-proof because the users are part of the building. And so that was, you know, and that's something that they were really adamant, because it was something everyone could take home. It was something that you could apply to any building you went to, even if it wasn't net zero.
That's pretty, it's actually pretty remarkable in that with LBC, it's not about proving that it could work in theory, it's about actually achieving net zero. So if we might design it to be net zero, but then somebody forget and leave lights on a long weekend, but like that could literally compromise their ability to get the certification. So there was a lot of faith that they were, I think, putting in the users, and a lot of responsibility for, you know, everybody collectively to be a part of it.
Yeah, and I don't know if people have questions for you about Living Building Challenge specifically, but that is a big difference between LEED and Living Building Challenge, just fundamentally, right? Is that Living Building Challenge is performance-based on recorded actual performance. Is that correct? Whereas LEED is really design-based. It's an analysis of your design.
Yeah. So yeah, the other piece that's more kind of regulatory is a pretty good story about how, you know, the Hitchcock Center had the benefit of being the third or fourth project in that area to go through Living Building Challenge certification. So The Bechtel Center at Smith was first, and then the project at Williams, and then the Kern Center and the Hitchcock Center happened sort of more or less in parallel. And when the Bechtel Center went to try to get their net zero water, they went to the local office of the state DEP and told them what they wanted to do, and the DEP was sympathetic, but said, there's really not a way to permit what you're trying to do. I mean, you can't catch water off the roof and have people drink it. We just can't do that from a regulatory standpoint. I mean, we get why you're trying to do that, but I don't think we can help you out there. And then the Williams College project came through, and they tried as well. And I think both projects ultimately ended up using a well and sort of rationalizing it that way. But then by the time the Kern Center and our project came along, we came through, and because LBC requires you to go and ask, even if previous projects have been rejected before, we sort of knew, okay, well, they're going to say no, but you got to ask, you got to have the paperwork. Then we went and DEP said, actually, we figured out a way you can do this. What you're really talking about is creating a public water supply. And so we actually have a form for that. You just take this form, and where it asks you for the size of your watershed, just cross out acres and write in square feet. And the last time they had used that form was when they permitted the Quabbin. So
wow. Wow, Sam, I'm so familiar with the problem, but I had not heard of anyone solving it. That's a great story. So yeah. Tell me, my last experience with this sort of thing, use the water for flushing, and our local plumbing inspector says, no, it's too dangerous because some child might drink it. But you're using it for more than, what are you using the water for when you say, oh, we're creating a water supply? Or do you actually use that water for potable water?
Yeah.
Wow, that's so exciting. I didn't even pick up on that.
Yeah.
And do you use,
okay.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, there's a small coda in that the story does not yet quite have as happy ending as it
I was just going to ask that.
As it is sometimes made out to be. I don't think either the Kern or the Hitchcock Center are up and running fully on their potable rainwater sources. The hang up is actually in the filtration method, and that the Living Building Challenge requires no chemicals, and the DEP requires them to use chlorine. So they're fighting that battle, both projects, to try to use UV light, and I haven't checked in on it in a while, but I think
that's what I was going to ask you, if you were using UV. Yeah.
So it's the UV is still an uphill battle with DEP, but both are pushing for it. But if either one wanted to switch over to a chlorinated system, it would be pretty simple from a DEP standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and yeah, it's interesting because one of the things LBC does is they give you reprieves if it's deemed illegal, and the regulators don't allow you to do it, but you can't not do something for the sake of money, right? So it might be that you've installed something and they've changed their mind and now they want a different filter, and you have to do it, right? So the first two projects Sam was talking about, they were told no, so they were able to do a well and kind of pitch it as a closed loop because they weren't allowed. But since we were, we had the opportunity and responsibility to have to figure it out and kind of take it to the next level. So it's really interesting. It's like once you ask the question, you're in for it. If allow it.
So it's been interesting.
No, and this is.
I was just going to say, both Kern and Hitchcock have their certification now. So I've had a couple conversations with the director at the Hitchcock Center and actually tried to encourage them to switch over to a chlorinated system because, in my opinion, obviously this is a subjective matter. I think it's more powerful to have a functioning potable rainwater system than to sort of be an absolute purist on it and hold tight on the UV piece of it. But they have not opted that way. There's some money involved for them still. You know, if they were to switch it over to a chlorinated system, that would take some investment and sort of capital to switch over the system for them. And right now, especially in the pandemic, they're low on funds. So I think they're on municipal water at the moment, still hoping to get their UV system permitted.
Yeah. Well, you're exactly right that the story you just told is driving, you know, the regulatory framework for this stuff. You know, last time I was involved in something like that, it hadn't gone nearly to that point of actually the potable water supply. So if they can start using the UV, it's also going to drive the cost of UV systems down over time as more of them are used. And that's really exciting.
Yeah, Michael, on my my tour of the Kern Center, the challenge, hi everyone, I'm an engineer, is that the you know, the UV light, it will kill, but it won't, you know, it will kill whatever growth is going on in the water, but then the water sits in the pipe waiting to get used. And when it's sitting there, that's where it allows the growth to occur again. Whereas the chlorine is always in the water, you know, eating away at whatever's growing. And so you have to come up, and it's an interesting problem that's been posed, like, you know, to Sam's point, like, you know, the first project introduced, you know, ground zero, like, what do we, or step one, like, what do we do? And then like each project is learning from and learning from and learning from. And so now the challenge that we're at is, you know, like what Sam described, perhaps we're using a chlorinated system, we back off of, you know, the kind of absolutism of no chemicals, or with the UV system. And maybe what we end up having to do is, and it may have an energy penalty, but like having a recirculation loop that's always filtering that water to maintain, you know, the microbial growth within the water, that providing, like, as a water authority, you have to maintain. It's an interesting problem, but, you know, thanks to projects like these, we're so much further, you know, along the way to the solution than we were, you know, 5 or 10 years ago. So as the engineer, and because Michael asked all my engineering questions, I'm going to go in a different direction. And we were talking about it a little bit before the plumbing discussion, but could you talk to me about how you work with your owners and especially the users? You know, the Hitchcock Center, the level of community engagement on that project, knowing that, you know, knowing them, they bought in. But can you talk about all of your types of projects, especially like the other ones that you shared? How do you get owner and user buy-in to the strategies and to get them to use the buildings the way that you intend?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's, you know, we would not recommend Living Building Challenge for every client, right? It has to be somebody who is bought in. And if you are kind of dragging a client along to Living Building Challenge, you're destined to fail, because it is a tremendous leap of faith. It will not be fun. Yeah, it's a tremendous leap of faith. And if they say, well, I'm only going to do it if you can guarantee me that it'll work, you should say, no, I will not guarantee you that it'll work. Yeah, it's an experiment. It is, you know, it's called Living Building Challenge for a reason, because it's, you know, it's sort of a living, breathing thing, and you need to sort of care for it and be willing to adjust on the fly and accept that there are some risks, like, you know, the DEP could come back and tell you your UV filter is no longer acceptable and you need to buy a more expensive one. So I think we try to right size the approach to the client. And I think, you know, a good example is a project that we're in CDs on right now, down at Quinnipiac University, which is a health and wellness center. And it was not originally out of the gate pursuing any sort of environmental certification. In fact, you know, our client, who's the facilities manager there, said, like, no, we don't need any of that junk. We don't need a plaque on the wall. Just, you know, do good stuff. And so we designed this whole health and wellness center on the idea of biophilia, and that the idea of health and wellness is intrinsically connected to our connection and relationship to nature. And so while it may not be about energy metrics, it is about creating access to nature. It is about creating a connection to it. So it's a wood structure. It's a CLT structured building. That's all exposed. We have a number of interior living green walls. It has a strong connection to the local stone palette. And so that has really resonated to the point where we're now in CDs, and we've been pitching sustainability and biophilia to them. And a couple of the trustees have come back to the facilities head and said, we're doing all this sustainability. Shouldn't we really be doing LEED, or should we look at LBC? So that's an interesting conversation in the middle of CDs, but it's still, a testament to the fact that you play to their strengths, you focus the programming and the certifications on what's important to them. And I think, it will ultimately yield the best results. When we started working with Hitchcock, and they said, well, would you ever advise anyone not to go LBC? They were trying to sort of figure out like what, whether it was really worth it. And we said, if LBC ultimately, the added cost of building an LBC project ultimately means that you have to compromise or undercuts your mission or program in some way, then you shouldn't do it. You're a nonprofit with a very specific and very important mission, and if the building certification process ever undercuts that, then you're doing something wrong. But if you feel like the building certification process supports your mission and aligns with your mission and supports your goals, and you don't mind putting money into something that is doing advocacy and promoting environmental literacy because it's aligned with your mission, then you should keep doing it.
Yeah, and on a project that's a health and wellness design and incorporating biophilia, one of the things that at least I found when you do pursue at least a health and wellness certification is so much of those are actually about operational policy, and it forces those discussions to happen that might not otherwise happen. The different stakeholders that you're pulling into the discussion, it really widens the audience for getting buy-in on the project. That say on a LEED project, we're just not seeing that, because it's just design team, check the boxes, contractor, check the boxes, move on, get the plaque on the wall. Whereas really getting that buy-in to make sure that the building is used and the occupants get the benefit of all the hard work that the design teams do is really important. Otherwise, what are we doing this for?
I would also say, just on some of the other projects, like we do talk early on about, what is it about this project that is really kind of at the heart of it, right? So we have to kind of lean into that, and it's a process of like communication and education to try to to kind of make the case, right? Like a lot of times we'll use research as a way to make the case for certain design decisions, and I think sometimes it's doing that when it comes to like equity or beauty or all these other things. And one of the things I've really appreciated about the Living Building Challenge is that they give you a lot of language to approach that, so we can approach biophilia as a value add and like what it can do. And we now have like data to support the benefit of this. Whereas before we might pitch it and be like, this would be a great thing, but not necessarily with the ability to like present it with language and kind of authority to have the client see the value in it. And I would say, like with biophilia, we very early on when we got this health and wellness, it's like, well, what is this project about? Like, what's important about it? Like, and biophilia almost immediately rose to the surface as, from the design team perspective. It wasn't anything that the client asked for, and then it was about like crafting the pitch to make sure that the school also saw that as an important thing, because now we're in CDs and they're not asking us to cut the expensive finishes, right? Because we've sold them on it. Like they're as into it as we are. And I feel like had they not been, and it's just something that we thought was important, but we didn't enroll them in that decision, then like, yeah, all the stone's going to come out because it's expensive, or the green walls, they're cut because, you know, it's a lot of money. But now, if anything, it's like, no, you will have all the green walls you promised us, and you will have all the stone that you promised us. So it's been really, I think, a great learning opportunity for us.
That really shows the power of the narrative in the design process too. Once the client understands the narrative that underpins what you're doing, then they get it and they know, wow, you can't take those green walls out, it falls apart. It's
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
well, we're at about 10 minutes after, and I think we're going to wrap up soon. I'd like to give everyone on the call a chance to ask any questions if you've got something on the tip of your tongue.
I'll kind of jump in. So we heard a little bit about the user and the owner. What was it like working with a contractor on an LBC project? Was there an education process that needed to happen there? I know it's not an everyday sort of thing. So can you talk a little bit about that relationship between design and contractor?
Yeah. So the contractor for the Hitchcock Center was really into LBC. They were actually the contractor, the same contract for the Hitchcock Center and the Kern Center.
Wow, who is that?
Wright Builders.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, you know, in the beginning, it was actually almost as much of a challenge as if they were a doubter, because they had as much enthusiasm and also as many opinions about what sustainable design looked like and should be, that they really wanted to share. And I think there was a mutual education process in that case about what sustainable design was now, where it was going. They'd been doing it for, you know, several decades in Western Mass, and had a lot of the sort of what I would say sort of older, more dogmatic views about what makes buildings sustainable.
Had no religion.
Yeah, we were accused of not having enough religion.
Around sustainability.
But you know, ultimately, I think it worked out great. I mean, I love the folks over there and would do another project with them in a heartbeat. But it was interesting to see sort of that even in that scenario, there's sort of feeling each other out and figuring out how it all comes together. But they were super into it, and I would say, you know, we couldn't have done the material vetting piece of it without their enthusiasm. I mean, we had a specific consultant responsible for the material vetting, and we actually their fee was split between us and the contractor. That we would do sort of pre-vetting with them, and then in construction, once we were sort of really nailing down specifics and knew exactly which product it was and getting, you know, sales receipts and all of that, they were working with the contractor to sort that out. So it was a very collaborative approach by the end of it.
They even made kind of a mini conference around it to kind of sell it to some of the trades in the area. And, you know, it was a lot for them to kind of pitch the benefit to the subcontractors, you know, like why it's good for them to not be working with toxic materials, or why it's important for them to not get materials from facilities that have been requiring workers to work with toxic materials. So it was definitely, I think they approached it from a very holistic place. So yeah, I mean, we both learned from each other to a certain degree, I'm sure, but it was really, really rewarding in the end.
Yeah, the Sustainable Construction Leaders Group is actually working on some guidance, and it was really valuable to hear them say, you know, it's our team, it's our staff that's manipulating these materials, that are cutting them, that are breathing it. Like, you know, it's one thing for the occupant to be in a space with the finished material. It's a whole nother thing for the contractors. Their exposure is much higher risk, I think, than based on the decisions that we as design teams and owners make about the materials that they have to install.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, and the manufacturers to some extent too.
And that's the thing. I think it's really easy to think of like VOCs and like what's the space that people move into. And I think this just requires you to think much more comprehensively about that. Like,
Yeah.
you know, what are the people 5 steps up, 10 steps up? Like, what's the impact on them? And, you know, is there a simple change we can make to eliminate that, you know, toxicity or whatever? But what else?
Hey, maybe we'll have a last question. If there are other questions that are hanging out there. Does anyone have anything more for Emily? I'm sorry, for Kelly and Sam?
Yeah, hi everyone. I've got one. My name's Eric. I'm an architect at Gensler. I just have a question about the CLT and how. And I know you mentioned it, but I'd love to hear more about how that had an impact on the accreditation process and what actually led you to using it.
So the CLT is actually being used in the Quinnipiac project. The Hitchcock Center did not have CLT. It has
Okay.
but it does. I mean, it is an all wood structure, so it is, but it's kind of a hybrid mishmash of wood. It's got
All the woods.
it's got a glulam frame on the walls and kind of edge beams. It has standard nominal press plate trusses for the roof that are just doubled up so that we could put them 3 feet on center instead of 18 inches. And then the whole thing is covered in a tongue and groove, about, you know, 1.5 inch solid casing around it. And then the whole thing is insulated on the outside with a sort of rain screen type system on the walls and the roof. So it's pretty interesting in that there is no wall cavity. It's exposed structure on the inside and insulated and weatherproofed on the outside, and it takes advantage of some of the thermal properties of solid wood structures. We read a lot about and talked to Kyle Moe a bunch on his research on solid wood and the thermal benefits of that beyond just R value, and we're really trying to push that as well. So it is a pretty interesting kind of makeup of structure, though it has no CLT officially.
Got it. And what were some of the other thermal properties you mentioned besides just conductivity?
Yeah, so he talks a lot about, I'm going to mess up the pronunciation, emissivity and effusivity, but essentially it's the feeling of the product, right? So you can have a product with a super high R value that is still very cold to the touch, and is not necessarily comfortable to sit on or lean against or be near. And also the sort of fluctuation, you know, that the R value is a measure of thermal transmittance between two temperatures, but with the sort of daily fluctuations in temperature, you often have a situation where it's hotter outside during the day and colder outside during the night, and that R value is not actually a great measure of the effectiveness of an envelope in something with that much fluctuation. So you can talk about it a lot better than I can, and unfortunately a lot of these things aren't as measurable as R values, so they don't get quite as much airtime or quite as much focus. But a lot of his research.
Moe. I see a question. Yeah. Kyle Moe.
Yeah, Kiel Moe. And
he was at Harvard. Where is he now? Do you guys know?
I don't know where he is now.
He's, I think, at McGill, or he was. I don't know if he's still there.
Yep.
Started at Northeastern, then went to Harvard, and I think he's now at McGill.
Mm-hmm. But it was interesting because that system not only that was kind of, you know, just the whole envelope design wasn't a typical, you know, envelope system that we've worked with before. And Sam did a super deep dive into the research around that and kind of talking with Kyle and everything. But, you know, it also allowed us to have the cozy building because now everything that was exposed was wood, which they really liked. It also allowed us to show all of the building systems through the project, which was really important for the educators to see, like, you know, they wanted like every pipe exposed. That was important for people to see what happens in the walls. And so it was interesting because again, it was like, we went super deep dive into the like science and research around this thing that could also give us like 5 other benefits, some of them just purely educational. So
Yeah, they really didn't want the building to appear too sterile. They had been to a lot of high performance buildings that they felt were just far too sterile. And so this really helped with that.
Yeah. It's so funny what you were just talking about, Kelly, that you almost have to quantify cozy now because cozy is too soft. So like they
were all about cozy.
You have to be able to explain it like keel, I don't know, kielmo, I always said.
You could always use the Danish word hygge.
Yeah, exactly. But like no one takes it seriously until you can quantify it and call it emissivity or whatever.
Yeah, and like the coziness was really something that was important to them, and that came from them. But I think, you know, along the way there were a lot of things that they were really interested in, and ultimately as we started looking at it in parallel with other building systems that we wanted to do and other learning opportunities, they just fell away because it was, you know, a non-necessary added, you know, system. Or you remember they wanted to do the outdoor living machine? Is that what it was called?
Yeah.
Wastewater, but then they wanted composting toilets. And so we did like an analysis of the two in terms of like, what are the teaching principles of each of them? And like, are you going to have more wastewater just so that you can have this, you know, outdoor, you know, living machine? Or is it more important to talk about composting and how, you know, nature composts and recycles things? So it's really interesting because like even early on when it's like conceptual design, we're looking at it both from the learning and the kind of engineering of it.
Okay, well, anyone is welcome to stop me and chime in with, but I think that was a great session. I think we're going to wrap up. So I want to say thank you to Kelly and to Sam and designLAB for 2 things: for your great work that I know takes so much discipline and hard work, and for your generosity of sharing it with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Sure. All right, everybody, stay healthy.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.